This podcast is in partnership with Norse Group, the public services consultancy. Norse Group is the largest commercial local authority trading company in the UK, 100% owned by Norfolk County Council. Visit norsegroup.co.uk. Welcome to this very special podcast episode for public finance, in which we will discuss and analyse the pressures UK government is grappling with at all levels. Our podcast explores and explains the biggest issues facing UK public services, and we're going to be looking at financial resilience. This episode is brought to you in partnership with Norse Group, the leading service provider for local authorities. Our episode today is called Facing the Unknown. I'm Chris Smith, I'm the editor of Public Finance, and here to discuss this with me are two very special guests. I'm delighted to welcome, first of all, Jonathan Werron is the Chief Executive of Localis, the leading local government think tank. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris.
And also taking part is Justin Galliford, who is the Chief Executive of Norse Group. Welcome aboard.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here today.
So without further ado, let's get underway. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot going on at the moment. Budgets are being set across the country based on known knowns and against a background of concerns about future financial stability for councils. I'd like to start by identifying the obvious risks, and I thought what we could do is borrow what was known as the Donald Rumsfeld soundbite, where he said there are the known unknowns and the known unknowns, and actually it's I think it's quite a useful analogy. So, Jonathan, perhaps you can start. What are the key things right now that are on the agenda for council leaderships? What do we know? What are the known knowns?
Okay, I'd counter that, Chris, with a political quote from Dennis Healey from the dark days of the mid-70s, when he talked about the skies are darkening with the wings of many chickens coming home to roost. So the known knowns we have are those wings. It's council finances, the fact that at the start of the political cycle in 2010, the council tax made a quarter of local authority revenue. Now it's half. What are we having now? Many councils will have set their budgets. We've got the Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor National Budget next week. And all we know is councils are raising, where they can, council tax to the hilt. There's some good notable exceptions for councils. You can do the opposite, Kensington and Chelsea and Surrey. But in the main, they're increasing their tax to the hilt to provide fewer discretionary services, which people understand because of the distorting effect of social care funding, which is still a can that's been kicked down the road as a known. And none of this is helping the financial underlying stability of our local authority. So even raising as much as they can, it's not do anything. That is the known. The known unknowns are things like demography. We know how much the proportion of the population is aging, requiring care services, but we don't know the impact of things like children's services for the effects of COVID, how much more mental health provision is needed, how many more children going through the care system. So the known unknowns are due to demography. In some of these things, Chris, we can get a fix through last year's census, which is, in terms of local service provision, quite important. And if we were to navigate our way through them, I'd say, we talk a lot about public service integration, but the need to have wholesale integration of public sector data sets to embolden working, that might offset some of those known unknowns.
So having really good visibility through data is one area that we can sort of explore a bit later on. But so Justin, obviously you're talking to your customers and your partners and the other key organisations in the sector, and obviously Norfolk, big county council with its own very a very distinct set of issues. So what are they telling you?
The message really is similar, but it comes out in different ways depending on the area of service you're looking at. I think Jonathan outlines it well. It's huge pressure on budgets. And I think so many councils have done such a good job in maintaining services. And of course, they've got an obligation from a statutory perspective. But it's not just about that. They want to maintain quality as well. And what they're really saying is we need new ways of making sure we can keep delivering services in a world which constantly evolves, where people expect more. You could take something as simple as environmental services, refuse collection, street cleansing. But again, actually, as Jonathan mentions, councils now need near real-time data on what's happening so they can feed back, because I think one of the things we see out of the back of the pandemic with hybrid working is something which we've discussed before at Roundtable, but this concept of hyperlocal. Lots more people are working in a hybrid fashion, which means they're home a lot more. They see things and they have a different expectation perhaps of what some elements of council service might be. So definite budgetary pressure, and how we can still keep innovating with them, really through co-collaboration in terms of service design.
I think something, I think it's worth exploring a bit later on, is the COVID period and some of the lessons that probably should come out of this, because it was for absolutely everybody a very, very significant moment, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's talk about those statutory demands. You mentioned that. I mean, it's things like social care and children's services. We've got things like mental health, and also part of that is you're working with other partner agencies who are also facing the same budgetary pressures. So, I mean, what are the implications for both the organisations and their communities? And also, we've got this other element, and we might follow up in a moment, is the political uncertainty too, because it does feel that we've been through multiple prime ministers, multiple ministers, lots of change in policies, things like interest rates moving as a result of policy decisions. So there's also been a lot of political uncertainty too. So Jonathan, what's your reflections on what all of this has meant for both? We touched on it a moment ago, but what it actually means for organisations and their community, because in the end, all of these organisations are public facing to a group of local people.
Very good question. At Localis, we're having a deep examination into local public service reform and integration. Because I think what we find, Chris, when we were sort of covering this at the time, say 8 years ago, when Pickles was bossing around Marsham Street. Essentially, we had sort of the whole place community budget agenda, which was essentially rebadged Total Place. Eric kind of lost interest in that, and after 2015, Greg Clark comes in as Secretary of State, and immediately, what's his interest? It's economic growth and devolution. And it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, Justin or Chris, that over the last 8 years, councils have had to go through their own very radical reform programme in line with essentially not as bad cuts as they had at 2010. That's sort of bleeding's been staunched more or less, but they've had to reform radically how they go about delivering neighbourhood services and the like. Central government really wasn't interested until about this time a year ago, when Michael Gove, in his first stint as Levelling Up Secretary, published the Levelling Up White Paper. I had the privilege to be amongst the other think tanks in the pre-publication briefing. So on one hand, you had Andy Haldane, former Deputy Director of the Bank of England. His complaint was, look, for economic growth, I don't have enough hard economic regional data. I've got soft understanding. Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, don't forget, former Education Secretary, bossing around education. He had Ofsted. He had at the tip of his fingertips everything he needed to do about school attainment. But when it comes to local government, he doesn't have the same. He can't recreate the Audit Commission. It's not going to wash, but he wants a better understanding of local authority performance. So we've got this, the creation of Offlog to look at this. We've also got the issue too when it comes to local authority financial resilience. We don't have a strong system of audit in place that needs bolstering. So we've got things about capacity. It comes down to capacity, Chris. I would argue the argument's been inside out. You got to start with high quality neighbourhood services at the local and the hyperlocal level, as Justin's being saying, and build from there to the strong local economic growth and the stronger regional and national growth. And this is it. So I think it's all about how we can integrate public services across agency and giving local authorities the ability to lead, to convene as selfless, generous leaders of place to make it all happen, without which it can't happen. In terms of the national political programme, these have been difficult times, have they not? In the last, let's pick up for one example, housing secretaries. We've had, I think, enough for a starting 11 and about 2 or 3 substitutes in terms of housing.
I'm mentally racking up in my head how many have there been, and I couldn't give you an instant answer.
There hasn't been the stability, local economic growth. Clearly, when we were looking at this 10 years ago, we know the excitement was the abolition of the Audit Commission in the bonfire of the Quangos, the abolition of regional government, getting rid of the government offices for the regions, dismantling the 9 English RDAs. Now, the local enterprise partnerships, I think they're in for a torrid time in the next budget. They're probably, that we might see a dismantling of them or just incorporation within combined authorities. But even in terms of local economic growth, the partners authorities need have been disappearing. And this uncertain political climate hasn't helped. We've got 2 issues at hand, haven't we? We've got the May elections, which will, from speaking to Conservative leaders, they're not looking forward to them, would be a safe way of putting at it. And you've got the likely prospect of a spring general election 2024. And so really you've got many things in stasis, waiting for the end of one political cycle to end and the new to begin. So this has an impact. Shows will be kept on the road for funding, for future direction, but we're waiting for that galvanization, that transfusion of energy when the next political starts.
So if you like, I'm going to use an analogy, if you like, of metamorphosis. So we've got local government that is waiting for this beautiful new spring in which, great ideas and wonderful new opportunities are going to flourish. And at the same time, the other option is with everything that's flying around, your need as particularly if you're a chief executive, legally you've got to balance the books. There's things, if you talk about, regional government, things coming back and LEPs and everything else. So actually the other option, the safest option could just be to sit on your hands, hunker down, sit in the bunker and just wait for everything else. If you just sit there long enough, it'll all come around again. So there is, and that's also, let's be honest, has always been that element in part of local government culture. So what do you do? Do you adapt, or do you just sit tight and say, okay, we've only got 18 months, so we'll just sit this one out? Is that a viable strategy if you're thinking about risk? Maybe you're from your point of view, Justin. You've got things you need to get on with. The contract's been signed, so yes, you could just sit it out, couldn't you?
There's a real mix, Chris. You were quoting earlier the famous Donald Rumsfeld with the known knowns, but what we didn't get to was the unknown unknowns.
Okay.
A statement which I think you described earlier as equal genius and insanity in the same breath, which I think is a pretty good description. But
yeah. Okay, well let's talk about those known unknowns and the problems that you think. So if you eat either which way, there's going to be some things on the horizon, and we're not entirely sure.
I think what you have to do is really reflect, and Jonathan touched on it earlier, I think you did as well, what the last 5 years outside of politics have looked like. If you went back 10 years and said, in the next decade, you're going to experience Brexit with an outcome which maybe people didn't quite predict.
Didn't plan for.
COVID, not on anybody's radar.
Right.
Inflation, war in Ukraine, they're linked, but are also different. The reality is we are in a period of geopolitical instability, which I don't think anyone could have predicted, and is probably the least secure since the end of the Second World War. I don't think, in general, hunkering down and hoping it's going to blow over is the answer, because we don't know what's coming next, but there will be something, and all these things have got quite a way to go before the macerations play out and things become stable. So I think one of the things that local authorities were really good at during COVID is doing some really good ad hoc ad-libbing, as all organisations had to, but they were right at the front and they kept delivering services and actually did it really well, touching on some of the things we talked about,
So being a bit canny and being able to sort of shapeshift a bit.
Thinking outside the box, and culture is a really important part of it. But I also think within that, there are some real challenges when you think about some of the conversations we have with potential customers and existing customers on things like environmental services. Much awaited in the sector is exactly what the Environment Bill is going to bring for obligations with regards to how local authorities collect waste. And really, is it going to be deposit return? Is there going to be source segregation at curbside? They're huge logistical changes to operations, but the practical implication is when authorities are looking to replace vehicle fleet, what do you order? That sounds really simple, but actually it's very complex.
It's nuts and bolts, but so there's, and also it's the point where aspiration meets reality.
So it's about having a strategy that helps councils and helps the public sector navigate through a period of real uncertainty until we get some certainty. And I think you have to look at what's in our national control to bring certainty around, and I would say legislation is one of those, and what's outside of that. And of course, inflationary pressures that are global and the war in Ukraine, largely outside of our control, albeit, government can incentivise through things like energy reduction caps. So your risk map's really important, and that shapes your culture. And I think that's what we see more authorities starting to do. That's a real change in mindset.
So it's almost like the rule book of what can you control, what can you influence. Yeah. Jonathan, what's your thoughts?
Very much echoing Justin's. Do what you can with what you have where you are right now. There isn't going to be any immediate salvation from the centre for any conceivable period. We put out an essay collection last week, which Public Finance covered a great essay from Dr. Mark Sandford from the House of Commons Library. There's a clear case for. This comes down to fiscal levers councils have or which they lack. We'll see what Jeremy Hunt can offer in terms of business rates or other small aspects of fiscal devolution next week. But clearly, there has to be. There's a growing consensus something needs to shift. Even George Osborne was rattling on about it in his Spectator diary column today, that if there is any continuity for levelling up, councils, local authorities have to be able to raise or lower tax in their area to stimulate economies and all the rest of it. In the meantime, we have the unwinding of that commercial council legacy, which was being very much foisted upon councils at the tail end of the Pickles years, when they're being told, no, raise your piggy bank for your reserves. And it's quite notable in that context, isn't it, Chris, that one of the four prime areas which the new OFLOG, the Office for Local Government, will be looking is council reserves. So there are risks in how councils are able to transform. But it has to come down to what Justin's talking about, that whole place pan public sector integration, which councils clearly have to lead because they have uniquely the democratic accountability to bring it all in line.
Let's kind of drill into this a little bit, because and this is something I think is worth following up on, is that it's almost about knowing who you are and knowing who your community is and knowing who the other partners are in a local area. So it's almost about place, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it all comes down to place. I think, and again, it's something that councils really recentered and helped the public re-understand almost through COVID, because it brought so many different partnerships and so many different people together to support place in ways we'd never had to before.
Right. And there's also, to me, there's also another element in all of this, because no two places are the same. And it sounds like a cliche until you actually think about it. So say, for example, if you're in London, one of the 33 London boroughs, even within London, so the demands in Hackney are very, very different to the demands that you're going to be facing out in, say, for example, nice green leafy Havering. Some of it's physical, some of it's just age and demographics, some of it's to do with education. And also, if you then sort of stand London against somewhere like, say, Bradford, again, completely different picture, completely different set of needs. So it's almost like, can we actually have if also you flip that back, let's say you're in Whitehall, you're Michael, let's pretend, you're in that Whitehall department, we've got a levelling up agenda, and the idea is that here is a set of tools, or some money, or it's some priorities, and Whitehall saying this is what you need to do. Is that even practical, given that each of those places all have different demands? So there's challenges within the challenges, aren't there? Justin, what's your take on can a Whitehall department say, right, here you go, this is what you must do? Or actually, is it about the local communities coming together and, partnerships, say, for example, across London, this is what we're going to do, and just leave us alone to get on with it?
I think some of the latest thinking and research suggests that local authorities, I think many of us would have assumed that, but it shows that local authorities are best placed at district, maybe county level as well, to really focus that funding. The DCN did some work. They commissioned Britain Thinks, and it showed, I think, about over 57% of respondents really understood and valued their district council and felt they were best placed to look after those issues of place and also help grow the local economy. So I think when you ask how can Whitehall best spend its money, it's a perennial question. Yeah. But, it's obvious to say, but I think without a really clear mechanism to understand exactly what place means for each authority when you're looking at levelling up, whatever it might be, can you really place the money in the best place? And I think, as always, those communications between two-tier councils up to central government, more important than ever. And sometimes I think people feel the conversations don't happen quite readily enough. But the art of conversation is where it's at, because till you really understand, how can you really focus the money well?
Jonathan, I'm going to describe you as an influencer. If we're in the 21st century, you're an influencer talking to the policy people within Whitehall. What's your take on all of this?
Well, from the levelling up agenda, the bit that always resonates with me and Lucalis is pride in place, that sense of place patriotism. People love where they live. Every survey shows that. The DCN survey from Britain Thinks, I'm sure if you had this down to parish level, it would be more the same. People trust their generally local, hyperlocal representatives. And the idea that this can be instilled from Marsham Street, or even through the legislation, 12 levelling up missions, some of which are unquantifiable, some unattainable, and with a generic Whitehall quango looking at this in place seems ridiculous. No, it's like, if you're a follower of the podcast The Rest is History, they're doing the Ronald Reagan's political ascent, and it really is that kind of, to bastardize that line, the worst words you could hear, I'm the man from Whitehall and I'm here to help in terms of local growth and all the rest of it. So clearly this has to be devolved. Does it always have to be a Punch and Judy central local relationship? No, it can be nuanced. It can be self-supporting, but it has to come at that level of trust and respect, which I guess is where it does come down to, and which we know, even in the midst of a potential change in political leadership through the next cycle, we do have this tendency for oppositions to be very strongly localist, right. But the boot comes very quickly onto the other foot when in power, and we need. This
was one of the criticisms of Labour post 1997. There was lots of ideas and everything was going to be brilliant, and then very suddenly you're behind the desk and it all goes out the window. I wanted to pick up on something there, because one of the issues that you raised there is trust. And if we're talking about financial resilience and managing risks, there is also the risk and with all of this, the cost of getting it wrong. So, if you've got the perfect local authority whereby the local community has told you exactly what they need, and you're really clear about how you're going to get there, and you've also, if you've got a group of people who are innovative and got lots of ideas, we have seen this in local authorities where they came up with, say, for example, things like, we're going to, there's a need to resolve housing. Here's a solution to deal with that. And it has gone wrong. So, how can the risk of failure be avoided? That's a kind of a crux part of all of this as well, isn't it? Justin, your thoughts. It looks to me like you've got some ideas.
Yeah, but that's not just my podcast face, Chris.
Right.
I think there's a number of things, really. I think the first is, as you say, and Jonathan points to, over the last decade or so, local authorities were forced to take these commercial initiatives. And actually amongst that, there's a whole load of collective learning. So one of the really important things is, let's be honest about the failures, so that there's a good element of self-teaching there, I think. And you do see that, I think. But lessons from history are really, really important. I think the second is when you're looking at setting up an initiative to give you investment on return, it's really important to really consider why you're doing it. What is your driver? And they can be very different when you think about what you seek to achieve from it. Because if it's just about margin and getting more cash in, that might be more risky. So are you really about getting a strong financial return in, or are you trying to, quite understandably, look to solve a local political challenge, improve place, which may not bring you the same level of return, and that brings a different set of risks. So a very open, honest assessment of what it is you seek to achieve when you start out is quite important, so you don't get lost in the commercials of it.
And there's something else, and Jonathan, I want to bring you in on this here, is that SIPFA did a piece of research in looking at cities around the world where they'd managed to drive real change and modernise and do lots of things for the communities. And one of the pieces of learning from it was that actually you have to take a long view. Now, for politicians, you're in a 4-year election cycle. 5 if you're in Westminster, and there's the community, as you touched on, is getting increasingly demanding. So there is a pressure to deliver big wins quite quickly, and that creates risk in itself. So, and we're into we still have a very short-term financial cycle. So how can you look at a big So if you look at this as, say, for example, if we've got a project like a community project and you're involving third sector, or the criticism from third sector is we've got to have, this is a 5-year project and we have 1 year's worth of funding. So there's almost, you have risk being created and uncertainty because there is no long-term view. And in a year's time, as we've seen, you can have different ministers, new agendas, and so on. So, I mean, how do we move out of that set of circumstances?
It's a difficult mismatch, Chris. I was very inspired on our travels with Lucalis. We went to Newcastle earlier in the week to hear the United Team of Chief Executives from there talking about a 50-year vision. There's something that doesn't exist in Whitehall, as you said. And just a quote...
Let's explore that just very quickly. So 50 years.
Yes.
I mean, that's big, isn't it?
Our best local leaders are thinking about the health, the well-being, the longevity, the change in their communities over 5 decades. Compare and contrast the follow the money of, say, Bayes-led decarbonisation budgets, where everyone's got to bid at strange times. It's a bit like sort of Alice Through the Looking Glass, that kind of caucus race, running about in circles in races that never end. The game stops, and suddenly you've got a 2-month window to bid for money for next year or the year after that doesn't match long-term place needs.
And not everybody's going to win in that.
Yes, I think that all these things, whether it's climate adaptation, decarbonisation, what our local authorities need from combined authority level down is to be able to attract institutional investment, patient funding, which is desirous, looking for a long-term return from clean energy projects, climate adaptation. The problem is, even though with the 2050 target, is there really that understanding or that willingness from central government to enable these local investable propositions to find their funders to work their own way out?
Well, let's talk about the net zero agenda, because I think we really are at the foothills of all of this. No one really yet understands. There's been some at one level we ask for political leadership, don't we? Someone needs to do something about this. Where are our leaders? leaders and they say, right, we will be net zero, here's the dateline, and we've all got to get on with it. Actually, up behind that, what does that really mean? And there's some big risks there, aren't there?
It's fascinating listening to the conversation, because I think the really important thing, which ties into net zero, is long-termism brings stability. And that doesn't mean you have to have all the answers. It means you've got a long-term vision and you don't get swayed by funding crisis after funding crisis, which, as you say, if you're not careful, is exactly where you can get pushed to. Taking that long-term view, I mean, it's what we do with partnerships. And actually, as an example in our joint ventures, that allows us to make investment decisions because we know the returns may not be quite as high as you'd get in the marketplace if you really tended to work aggressively.
Well, let's take that as an example. So, say for example, with schools partnerships. Now, I can think of things like the healthy meals agenda, and obviously we're in an energy crisis. So the things like you might have a piece of kit that's going to be really energy efficient, and also enables you to bring in better food into the menu choices, something like that. But that piece of kit's going to, I'm guessing would be very, very expensive. So you'd mean to be looking at 5-10 years worth of payments on that piece of kit, and at the same time you're going to be working with an organisation that's it's a contract might be 1 or 2 years. That's a risk to you, isn't it?
It certainly, yeah, it is, and that's a fairly real example. But what you have to do is form a relationship. But yes, it starts as contractual, but you can turn it to more of a partnership approach, right, which says we can invest if you give us longer term surety as best you can. And actually it comes down to relationship. When you align your values and you align your aims, you build a working relationship which can transcend the contract. So you get to a position where you can have a sensible conversation about how things extend. And when you have that type of working relationship, that type of co-collaboration, right, that's what allows you to take this longer term view and then promote that stability.
So Jonathan, is this something that we also need to see? Does it need to start in Whitehall and Westminster? Politics is a tough business. We're in short electoral cycles and things like that. This seems like a very sensible idea. I mean, how can we replicate, people taking a long-term view if it starts with the decision makers and ultimately the people who have the purse strings? That's surely going to be the thing that's going to drive the as they say, be the change that you want to see.
Yes. When it comes down to which of the cultures, national or local, will prevail, will predominate, it's interesting though. Justin, you made the very good point earlier in the discussion about the geostrategic shifts, and I think we are. I know we'll talk about COVID later. We are coming to an acknowledged need for a more resilient economy, a more resilient nation. We can't rely on food imports all the time.
We've had, as you rightly say, we've had weeks with there being no tomatoes on supermarket shelves. I mean, that's a very real thing, isn't it?
Yes, but that's a very real thing. As someone who's always buying last minute cucumbers from Sainsbury's local for the kids' lunch boxes, which
there are that we ought to point out there are other supermarket choices available.
Indeed, there are. You see the prices, but come down to the local authority planning. Right. We need to be building vertical farms like they do in the Netherlands. But does the NPPF, does our national planning policy framework really enable us to have that resilient food security we need? I probably know we had a webinar on it yesterday. I think the answer is probably not yet, Lord Copper. So we know. I think we need a more attuned, resilient state. That can only happen at the level of place. What does place need? It needs purpose. It needs jobs. It needs skills for the health and the well-being. And as we were saying earlier, it starts at the very simple level of decent, high quality neighbourhood services as the platform from which we can build a strong economy, a strong resilient state that can maybe trade to its weight to keep our weight in the world, and to finally combat the besetting sin of every post-war government, which is we don't grow the economy enough to cover what we need to spend as a nation if it's to be a compassionate nation.
Wow. I mean, okay, so this is almost, if you like, the esprit de corps and the call to action, as it were. And does government, does Whitehall get this, and does it get what local is about? And in order to, the old saying, first of all, before you can solve a problem, you have to understand that you have a problem. Is government and Whitehall, in a place of understanding this?
Well, I would say, Chris, these have been rather halcyon days all years for place policy. The levelling up agenda has focused everything on the level of place. And in my experience, I always find members of parliament far more aware and cognizant of regional differences in all different parts of the country than always equal to their officials. So it's there, it's understood. I guess the problem is getting the machinery of state, the besetting silo mentality to work. For many of the crises we have at the moment, or asylum being topic of the day, you can name many other examples. Whitehall is very good at parcelling billions in the hundreds of billions to solving problems, but without coming close to addressing the problems. I would say the argue is the need to reconfigure the central machinery of state in a way that genuinely delivers. And in part of this, they need to trust local leadership. They can't be dismissing local leaders as people not good enough because they're not in central government. It's got to be based on partnership and trust. And I would know, as Lord Peter Hennessy was on the Today programme a while ago talking about our national problems. And it's something he said that resonated with me, which is, look, underneath there are subterranean channels under the limestone landscape we live in, an undercurrent of decency and understanding which can carry us through. I believe that is shared amongst all parts of the country, and it shouldn't be beyond our ability to get the gears working again.
So if with this issue of financial resilience, so you actually think there, the capacity actually is there at local level, and let's not forget we've also got we've got regional mayors and so on, and the landscape is changing, and we're also talking and we're hearing about government and opposition parties all talking about plans for more devolution. So you're confident that the capability, the skills, the nous is there in those institutions?
I'd say to be a localist, you have to be an optimist.
Right.
A phrase from G.K. Chesterton, he said, the only true revolutionary is the optimist, because he'll see the good in people and situations. Yes, local government has problems of governance. Croydon seeking $500 million wiped off. Thurrock, we have examples aplenty. I think there is a need to get things in order. Maybe there's a missed opportunity from not taking on board the full recommendations of the Redmond review. But I think a consensus is emerging that can see us through with good people who can be trusted. But as Justin says, we can't shy away from the problems where they exist. I think there has to be a stronger corporate response to this from across the sector. We did a report with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, looking at some of they created a toolkit looking at how anyone from a backbench local councillor to a junior officer can pick up the pieces here. It's all our responsibility. If every player's on the pitch, I think we can address these problems.
Do you see evidence of capacity and excellence with the organisations that you work with?
We see some incredible things happening. I think when you consider the pressure that councils are under from a budgetary perspective, they still keep statutory services going. You have to remember that, and many of them are still innovating within that. So, I think there's some remarkable capability. I think you also have to contextualise it. It's easy to get drawn into the debate about, does central government support local government? Is it really fair? Does local government have the right lines back to central? Actually, both of those organisations, both of those setups, so to speak, do a really difficult job. Your local government is there for local people. Central government, by definition, can't be local to everybody. And actually, there are huge budgets to manage at both local and central level. And you could probably say at any point in time, oh, it hasn't been done very well. But it's immensely complex. So I think it's quite unfair when you see analysis that says this has been misspent or that's been misspent. No one in the public sector goes out their way to not do their job well and mismanage things. I think you have to acknowledge there's a real set of capabilities. And I think what we see is the growing capability for local authorities to reach out and find that expertise when they need it.
Right. I mean, a good example of this maybe is perhaps COVID. I mean, I think there's some, it was sort of very, almost like a sort of a Second World War moment. There was some, it was Optala, which was there was literally one day the country was living and working, and the day afterwards, it absolutely wasn't. So, I mean, there's an element here of where is the boundary for central government, and and is it too controlling? Because do we need, is it coordination? I mean, with lockdown, there was a point where the country needed to stop, and particularly, say for example, if there was a natural disaster, that's the point where central government steps in. So are there any lessons? What are the things that you took away? I mean, we saw some wonderful moments where we all clapped for the NHS. There was a lot of community stuff. Central is COVID the model, or is that the example of how things could be, or what are the lessons that we can take away from that period? I
mean, I would say one of the big lessons is flexibility. Right. That's certainly something we did in our partnerships with local authorities. Is we flexed how we did things and what we did, as we all know, on a day-to-day basis as guidance and legislation changed. And local authorities' ability to think creatively around that was really impressive. Right. I think the second thing is the co-collaboration piece with lots of different groups in local authority remit and third sector to really bring everyone together. But when you really bring that down to what we're talking about here and you think about long-termism, the challenges of net zero and the need for investment, and local authorities, many local authorities still need to invest commercially in some way in order to help balance the books and bring revenue in. There's a real opportunity, I think, from central government to help grow the economy, and it comes back to net zero. Jonathan outlines one challenge. We don't have planning regulations, for example, which allow us to vertically farm. But think about a toolkit from central government that allows local authorities to consider initiatives around net zero to help them achieve net zero locally, to help grow the local economy. That's a commercial proposition worth thinking about. And at the same time, you're skilling local people in green technologies. So you're getting a true return on your investment from a financial and an ethical perspective, as well as tackling one of the most pressing problems that we face as a species. So I think bringing all that together, to me, it's all about net zero on that journey.
Right. I mean, what you also are talking about is it's almost like I'm getting a vision of what a local authority 2.0 or 21st century, whatever you like. There's almost like a vision of what this organization can be, and it needs to be a bit flexible. It was a very interesting piece of research the other day that said I think there are 80 new jobs coming down the line because of things like AI and whatever else. There are jobs that haven't even been invented yet. So there's a future that is coming, and we're not entirely sure what that is. But there's also a thing here. There was a mantra back it was certainly in the 90s and through Australia, that public sector organizations needed to be more like the private sector. That actually there was it was the Toyota model, if you like, of lean organizations, and so it's just in time. Is that something that does still hold, or actually this vision of the new is something different?
I would argue that what does the private sector give to the public sector in commercial engagement? It's innovation. If as a local authority or public sector body, you're not getting the innovation, you might as well do it yourself, or take it on your own terms. So in this sense, I know there's a continued role for the private sector in providing they can deliver innovation and create value, something good, beautiful, and worthy. And I think the other way we can see this, because look, the public finances aren't going to get any better anytime soon, because the country is still trapped in its low growth model. This isn't going to change, but it can use things like what lever does it have, Chris and Justin? Social value. The government spends, but across the public sector, was it 400 billion plus a year procuring goods and services through social value? You have the ability to level up by giving communities down to ward levels the benefits they desire from public service contracting, which doesn't have to be identikit apprenticeships, what communities really want and desire. You've got social value as a great, not particularly maximised tool to your advantage. There are things now, innovation, and in terms of council entrepreneurialism, I think no, you only have to go to Birmingham's council house. You see what Joe Chamberlain constructed, an edifice of municipal magnificence from water and gas and electricity, so which essentially, until the immediate post-war period, your local council would run your electricity board. This is one of the things nationalised post-45. So there is a role for council creativity or entrepreneurialism, which I would argue we'd be wrong to stymie. But you said you have to temper that with what has gone on in recent years. You need stronger governance to make sure it works for all.
So it's almost like a going back to the roots, the founding principles of local government. We've put some firm foundations in things like audit and scrutiny and those kind of things. It's almost like William Morris with a policeman, as it were.
And if it takes a local or regional public accounts committee to make it local government finances intelligible, again, it's how understandable are they? I don't know. Many sort of senior council officers would say, well, in our organisation, maybe 3 people, including me, understand the entire balance sheet. So transparency and making things understandable, risk relatable might be a good thing to come out of all
and
this.
There's also, I'm looking at, you mentioned those 3 people in the organisation that understand it, but on the flip side, in the local community, there are probably only 3 people that will also read the documents, isn't there? So is there also an element here of local people, if our, COVID, where people have got really, really focused on the place where they live, is there also not a responsibility among, the people that live there to actually take an interest in the organisation that is supplying care for their grandparents and supplying, safe schooling for their kids, making sure that the roads are as they should be? Do we also need the public to engage with some of this as well?
I think we do, but I think some of that's transient, so it depends where you are in your life. If your children are at school, you're interested in local education. If you have a loved one in a care home, your focus may switch to adult social care. But I think what that tells you is that whenever someone's on that life journey, whichever element of service they're looking to, it has to be easy to understand. Right. And some of that is about social media, which, I think is a blessing and a curse in equal measure in many walks of life, but not easy for local authorities because there's so many things to talk about. You have to find a way of doing it, reaffirming those simple messages consistently through multiple channels, multiple different platforms to reach a target audience, because we know it can be very difficult, and we see that through partnerships.
It's as much about explaining the risks and explaining the decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Jonathan, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, clearly, sort of Uncle Eric's armchair auditor experiment didn't take off. That's maybe the straw man to this. But as Justin's saying, a vigilant citizenry are a great defence of local democracy, and especially in the light of well-rehearsed issues about the demise of local newspapers. It's a way of engaging. Would local politicians have anything to be worried about? Potentially, you can see the potential conflicts, but I'd say making your local public services understandable, communicating them a bit better than what you see in your council tax bill once a year when they do the pie chart and you see everything's going to social care. And yes, you understand why the swimming pool's closed and all the rest of it isn't enough. We can and should do better.
So, okay. So, Justin, one of the things here is on organizational risk and reputation risk. So, on this one, is leadership important? So, do really good organizations, do they need, is it as an inspirational leader, is that the ingredient here as well that is needed?
I think it's critical. You know, at the end of the day, leadership sets the tone and it shapes the culture. And culture is what really drives the values and sees them being lived out through everything that an organisation does in any walk of life. So it starts and finishes with leadership. Without leadership, you don't have culture.
There are many varieties of leadership. You could have like the charismatic combined authority leader, like the Ben Houchin or the Andy Streets, the poster boys, or the competent practical leader. What we need is good leadership in whatever shape that takes. Good values, strong commitment to place and people, the ability to listen to arguments and to serve selflessly for the people you serve in your locality.
So it's about good ideas, good foundations, and good leadership.
Exactly.
I think we might be onto something. So finally, I think this is a good point at any is to finish up our discussions, and that leaves me only to thank our guests. Jonathan Warren, thank you.
Great pleasure, thank you.
And Justin Galliard, thank you.
Been a pleasure, thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Public Finance Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. We look forward to you joining us once again in the future. Thank you for listening.